Welcome to everybody. Welcome back to those who were here last week and welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. As Father Lawrence said, there were a lot of comments and questions after last week's talk, both immediately afterwards on the Q&A function on the webinar, and then people also emailed. And I wanted to begin by thanking you for those questions and comments, which were really helpful for me to see what had struck you, what had landed. I guess what struck me is there was kind of three major threads in the comments. One was that a lot of people were struck by this sense of that I was trying to begin to explore of the essentially non-moralistic character of Christian virtue. That virtue is participation in the vitality of God. And one of the themes was people wanting to explore that a little bit more and its connection with contemplative practice. Another theme that people picked up on was a question about whether I think it's an effect of so many people meditating around the world that is in fact enabling the emergence of a deeper listening and a more holistic vision for human life. And that was a kind of hopeful sense that some people expressed. And then there were some questions about what all this looks like in practical terms, how it intersects, how this more contemplative vision of the moral life intersects with what is still there of a more dualistic vision of morality, either connected with apocalyptic kind of religion or with sort of reward punishment religion, and also how it intersects with the experience of despair that many struggle with. So those were some of the themes that emerged in the comments, and these are all issues that I hope we'll continue to explore in coming weeks, and I'll certainly be seeking to touch on those and then also picking them up again in the final session. So please, if you have questions or comments, send them in either by the Q&A function at the end of this webinar or over the week on the email, because it's really helpful. I wanted to begin tonight by reminding us of the underlying premise of these talks. Along with many others, I've said that the world's current crisis is not only about health. It's a crisis that confronts us with many truths too long suppressed or ignored. The fragility and structural injustices of our economic system, the interconnectedness of the human family, and of the human and natural worlds. And I suggested last week, and again, I'm not alone by any means in this, but I suggested that on the one hand, this disruption and suffering we are presently undergoing opens into opportunity. In some of the government responses designed to help people during the crisis, and in countless local acts of kindness and solidarity, we're seeing that we could choose at both national and global levels a more abundant and shared flourishing. At the same time, we're in a situation that renders us vulnerable to those who want to take advantage of the world's preoccupation and the redirection of attention and resources. We hear reports, for example, of environmental protections being rolled back in the United States and elsewhere, of autocratic regimes flexing their muscles, seeking to extend their sphere of influence, of corporations and individuals looking to profit from the chaos. So we are in a liminal space. How we come out of this crisis will be affected by how many of us can make space for and commit to the good. And last week I said that this series is about our formation as people who can respond to this crisis in a godly way. people who can undergo its suffering and yet be empowered to live from and into a different reality. Even as I say that, though, I'm conscious at times of a sense of overwhelm and futility. Who am I kidding? Do I really think that a bunch of meditators reflecting together on the shape of Christian virtue is going to make a difference to how this plays out? Maybe it helps us to pretend that our prayer, our thoughts, our personal journeys of transformation really matter, that they could really contribute something to the world's good. But come on, get real. And maybe you have these moments too. I know there are things I can say in response to my overwhelmed self, but sometimes they can seem a bit desperate too. And in any case, I sense it might be important not to move too quickly away from this desolate, almost despairing place. Because if we can't be here, if we cannot sense the weight of what's at stake, then nothing we say will be adequate to the truth of things. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine, wrote poet Mary Oliver in Wild Geese. And as we enter this second week of our series, I want us to be conscious of the forces arrayed against the world's transformation. Forces of extremism, ignorance, and narcissism, of dark money, and the ruthless self-interest of the world's oligarchs. I want us to be present to the sheer overwhelming complexity of the systems and processes with all their unintended consequences that comprise the life of the world. And to the fear that besets all of us, at least some of the time, which is that despite our best efforts and the goodness of many, we will not collectively enable a better world. That the powers of darkness are always going to be too strong for the rest of us. I said last week that one of the inspirations for our theme was the text of 1 Peter, the New Testament letter set for reading on Sundays during this season of Easter. Part of the appeal of this text is that it dares to speak of the call to holy living in a context of profound overwhelm and threat. It's addressed to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, to fragile communities suffering persecution and hostility at the edge of empire. And I'm wondering if the responsiveness this letter recommends might offer us a fruitful starting point for exploring the shape of virtue in our day, for how we too might be and act. So let me go on then by saying a little more about this text. It begins, as I've said, addressed to the exiles of the dispersion across Asia Minor. And a bit later, it refers again to its recipients as aliens and exiles. The scholarly consensus is that the sense in which the letter's readers are aliens and exiles is not on account of their nationality or ethnicity. They're not foreign residents or refugees. Rather, they are exiles because of what their Christian conversion has done to their social standing. God's call in Christ to the readers of this letter had radically altered their social status. They are Christians whose lifestyle marks them off as exiles from the society in which they live. And biblical commentator Graham Stanton goes on to suggest that their ambivalent social status as Christians living in a society which was at best hostile to them and at worst prepared to persecute them undermined their self-confidence as Christian believers. The letter therefore reminds them of the gift of salvation they have received from God. It offers words of encouragement that they might stand fast in their new life. And it teaches what it means to live well, in accordance with God's will, in their circumstances. As I've sat with this text, I've been struck particularly by two recurring themes. Two elements of holy living are identified that seem, for the writer of 1 Peter, to be absolutely key. The first is the sense he wants his readers to have of the magnitude of their calling, their vocation or destiny. The letter is addressed to those who have been, quote, chosen and destined by God, and suggests, or goes so far as to suggest, that from long ago, prophets had been searching for their sake into matters that are now announced to them. They are then exhorted to come to God, for though rejected by mortals, you are chosen and precious in God's sight. The letter draws on imagery from the Hebrew Bible to insist that you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And the response called forth by this high sense of calling is naturally that of obedience. And this is the second element that permeates the text. Quote, like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance. And again, now that you have purified your souls by your obedience to the truth, so that you have genuinely mutual love, love one another deeply from the heart. And not only must this response of obedience be directed to God, more problematically to our ears, the recipients of 1 Peter are told to submit themselves uncomplainingly to the suffering that befalls them in imitation of Christ. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse. For since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same intention, so as to live for the rest of your earthly life, no longer by human desires, but by the will of God. And even more problematically, from our point of view, a quite radical obedience to the circumstances in which they find themselves is commanded. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters. Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands. Vocation and obedience. It seems that in the imagination of 1 Peter, there's something about being freely subject to necessity, willingly obedient to call, and to what's given you that is intrinsic to holy living. Well, how this works isn't obvious to us. It may even seem repellent to us. But there's something in the sheer counterintuitiveness of it all that I think is important to explore. And that's why I've called this talk The Virtue of Necessity. Well, Simone Weil wrote, "Obedience is the supreme virtue. We have to love necessity." And again, we have to consent to be subject to necessity and to act only by handling it. Well, these are aphorisms from her notebooks. There's no reasoned argument that takes you to here. But I think what's fundamentally at issue for Weil is the question of the relationship between virtue and self-dispossession. Last week, I quoted Dietrich Bonhoeffer's letter to friends after 10 years of Nazi rule. He wrote, "Who stands fast? Only the one whose ultimate standard is not his reason, his principles, his conscience, freedom, or virtue." And notice here the emphasis on the possessive, his, who stands fast, not the one whose ultimate standard is my reason, my principles, my virtue, and so on. No, only the one, says Bonhoeffer, who is prepared to sacrifice all of these when, in faith and in relationship to God alone, he is called to obedient and responsible action. And Weil shares the same understanding. God only is good. You do not do good by acting in accord with your idea of the good, or by implementing your plan for achieving a desirable outcome. No, you do good only to the extent that you respond faithfully to the call of God, only by obeying the will of God. This is why we must dare to take seriously the fact that we are called. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, God's own people. You are being addressed. And it's why obedience is the supreme virtue. We should not take one step, even in the direction of what is good, Weil says, beyond that to which we are irresistibly impelled by God. And this applies to action, word, and thought. It's a kind of hyperbolic claim, but I think what she's trying to get at is that true virtue involves a radical self-dispossession. Weil's insight is that even the desire to do good or to make a difference, to help others or save the world is susceptible of corruption. It's almost inevitably bound up with our desire to feel good about ourselves, to know that we've done our bit or made our lives count for something. But just as the monk who does not know he is praying is the only one who truly prays, so the one whose left hand does not know what the right is offering does any real good. Weil is especially fond of the parable of the Last Judgment at the end of Matthew's Gospel, where those who receive the reward of the just are those who have no idea they did anything worthy of reward. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink. Obedience is the only pure motive, Vey writes. We must be compelled by a necessity that reaches us, as it were, from beyond us. This will often take the form of an evident need to which we cannot but respond. There's no question. I couldn't not do it. And what she's elaborating is the radically responsive and self-forgetful character of Christian virtue. Obedience is thus the root of a different quality of goodness. Goodness of a purity and unself-consciousness that reflects the purity and justice of God. Well, it's beautiful, but it's also an austere vision. And it seems to leave us with a couple of large problems. One is the problem of discernment. How do I, in practice, discover what obedience requires of me at any moment? How do I know that what I think is God's will really is God's will, as opposed to some well-meaning intention of my own? In relation to this question, both Bonhoeffer and Vey are clear that we can, in fact, never be certain of that. We are responsible for discerning as well as we can the call of God on our lives. And this is work. It's not just waiting around to be zapped by the Holy Spirit. We must employ all our faculties of critical thinking, emotional intelligence, practical wisdom, and deep listening. But even after we've sincerely undertaken all that work, it remains possible that we do not discern as deeply or truthfully as we might, that we are deceived or obtuse to some degree. This means there is a built-in moral vulnerability to Christian life. And it's why moral responsiveness is necessarily tied to prayer, particularly silent contemplative prayer. Vey says that although we can never know that God commands a certain thing, nevertheless, we are saved by the purity of our intention, the purity of our prayer. If we make a quietness within ourselves, she writes, if we silence all desires and opinions, and if with love, without formulating any words, we bind our whole soul to think, thy will be done, the thing which after that we feel sure we should do, even though in certain respects we may be mistaken, is the will of God. For if we ask him for bread, he will not give us a stone. In other words, Vey considers that the possibility of true or true enough discernment is founded not on the infallibility of our judgment, but in the goodness of God, to whom we entrust the possibility of our own goodness. If we ask God with all our heart for bread, we will not receive a stone. Vey speaks here of what we feel sure we should do after this process of inward listening and silence. My own experience is often not of feeling sure, but of feeling like I can't see any more clearly than this. And once it's as good as it's going to get, this is the point at which we must entrust our discernment and its consequent action to God's goodness and mercy, working out our salvation in fear and trembling. But there's no room here for self-righteousness or strident moral confidence. But the second issue raised by the emphasis on obedience as the supreme virtue is even more difficult. We saw earlier that 1 Peter appears to exhort its readers to obey not only God, but the givenness of the life they find themselves in. In situations of suffering and injustice, this seems highly problematic. Is this text really saying that being obedient to the suffering that befalls us, accepting the authority of every human institution we find ourselves enmeshed in, including unjust structures such as slavery and patriarchal marriage, that this is part of holiness of life? Everything in us balks. What are we to make of it? Well, I've already received some correspondence on this matter from members of the Benedictist community, and addressing this question adequately would take a whole series in itself. So here I'm just going to sketch the outline of a response. To lay my cards on the table, I take it for granted that slavery, the ownership and systematic exploitation of some people by others, is contrary to God's will for humanity. I take it likewise for granted that there are times when human institutions, emperors, governors, presidents, and the like, should not be obeyed, and that a good marriage is one where each partner is equally honoured and allowed authorship under God of their own life. So why doesn't 1 Peter say that? Well, context is everything. And scholars suggest that this text and others like it in the New Testament canon subverts some of the social norms of its time more significantly than we might realise. In particular, its assumption that the central relationship in Christian life is to God allows for a different perspective on relationships with the social other, while at the same time not giving cause for major cultural offence and increased hostility. Take 1 Peter's instruction to accept the authority of the emperor, for example. Stanton notes that at the time this letter was written, non-Christians in the area recognised the Roman emperor as a deity. But Peter explicitly identifies him as representing a human institution. The text reads, "As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honour everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honour the emperor." In this way, Stanton remarks, the divine emperor is, as it were, being cut down to size. His authority is to be respected, but there are limits to the honours he is to be accorded by Christians. In a similar way, slaves and wives are members of the Christian family who just do in this society occupy socially subordinate positions. They too are instructed to inhabit their stations in life respectfully and yet differently. Their honour for the human institutions to which they belong is to flow out of their primary relationship to God, rather than being simply determined by those who have immediate power over them. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. For remember that Christ also suffered unjustly and entrusted himself ultimately to the one who judges justly. And the letter goes on, wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Now we know that this kind of exhortation to uncomplaining obedience has been put over the centuries to terrible use. But notice, in a context where the divinity of the emperor and the power of slave owners and husbands was considered absolute, how profound a wedge this way of thinking introduces. We would like the New Testament simply to have denounced slavery and patriarchy. What was the matter with the early Christians, Rowan Williams has asked. Could they not see that slavery was wrong? Well, he goes on, the short answer is that probably they couldn't in any nice, clear, modern sense. They were as conditioned to see slavery as normal as we would be conditioned to see our ordinary patterns of social and financial life as normal. But to introduce the idea that slaves and women had a relationship with God that was prior to and undetermined by their relationship with their owners and husbands, to think that they might have a choice about how to be towards their situation, well, that introduces something distinctive and new. Ultimately, it was transformative. I know this doesn't resolve all the issues. The appeal to inward freedom while being outwardly oppressed only takes you so far, particularly since we now understand the extent to which outward oppression tends to colonize you inwardly. A slave can be made to believe himself subhuman. A woman to believe she matters less than a man. Where this is so, the sense in which there is any real possibility of free consent to the social dynamic in question is clearly limited. And this is why Weil is very clear that obedience as a virtue must be obedience to necessity and not to force. But for our purposes, I want to set aside these reflections on the particular exhortations to obedience in 1 Peter that so easily trip us up. And I want to return to the overarching question. And that is the suggestion that there is some kind of virtue in necessity, some sense in which accepting the givenness of the lives we're in is, at least in the first instance, and access to participating in the goodness of God and of enabling God's will to be realized on earth. And to make this real for us, I invite you now to bring to mind the givenness of your life. Maybe you might think of some of your more difficult family relationships or personal circumstances. Maybe you might think of the injustices you know you are bound up in, whether as a beneficiary of an unjust system or a victim. Think about the aspects of your life, your culture, your society that you cannot change simply by willing them to be different. What would it mean for you to accept the authority of the given? To seek to obey God in and through what is? What I'm beginning to sense is that the Christian emphasis on obedience as one of the highest virtues reflects the insight that true, wise, and reconciling engagement with the world cannot be rooted first and foremost in resistance to the world as we find it. If I want a difficult relationship to be transformed, for example, I know it doesn't work to begin by resisting it, fighting it. Somehow I have to accept that it is as it is. I have to try at least to accept the person I find difficult as they are, to embrace the whole dynamic of the relationship, its suffering, my frustration, my desire it be otherwise. I have to be with the sheer isness of it, of the whole of it. This doesn't mean resigning myself to live in a dysfunctional or oppressive dynamic forever. But if I can't be where things are, if I am unwilling to embrace and undergo the suffering of what's unreconciled, then I'm actually refusing or negating the possibility of its transformation. And when you think about it, the same seems true of the most profound social transformations. Consider the American Civil Rights Movement, for example, and the way Martin Luther King insisted on the necessity of not simply resisting or rejecting what was in the society he sought to transform. In fact, in the face of terrible persecution and hostility, the violence that led ultimately to his death, he sought to be with the whole of it in all its complexity and ambiguity. He wrote, "Some of the most vigorous defenders of segregation are sincere in their beliefs and earnest in their motives. Many are good church people, anchored in the religious faith of their mothers and fathers." He said, "With every ounce of our energy, we must continue to rid this nation of the incubus of segregation. But we shall not in the process relinquish our privilege and our obligation to love. While abhorring segregation, we shall love the segregationist. This is the only way to create the beloved community." Well, this is deep spiritual work. Rowan Williams describes Jesus' obedience to suffering and death as active and transfiguring acceptance of the world's limit. As with Martin Luther King, this active acceptance is quite different from compliant resignation to the status quo. But the insight is that transfiguring acceptance of the given is somehow the site of the world's transformation. The more we yield ourselves to discern the will of God in the world we're in, the more we grow in our capacity to act out of God's resource, and so freely, despite the limit. And this means that when we choose, of necessity, to withhold our consent or deliberately to disobey unjust commands or systems, then our responses participate in the truth of God and are obedient to a deeper law. Vey says, every creature which attains perfect obedience constitutes a special, unique, irreplaceable form of the presence, knowledge, and operation of God in the world. Well, I'm conscious that this is a dense train of thought, and we will be picking up on it again next week. So let me just conclude now with a few summary points. I began by speaking of a sense of despair that overwhelms me, overwhelms us at times, when we sense the scale of the transformation needed in the world, the scale of the forces pitted against the world's well-being. And the same can be true of seemingly intractable features of our own lives. The default tendency of our culture is to assume that if we care about changing things, if we care about the world's good, we need somehow to get on top of things, bring them under our control, to resist and then fix what's wrong. But the author of 1 Peter, writing to small and persecuted communities of believers who had absolutely no chance of getting on top of their situation or remaking it according to their version of the good, he enjoins a quite different response. He encourages them to remain true to their sense of having been called, addressed by God, and he asks them to look to obey God in and through the givenness of their lives. If things are to be transformed, more deeply integrated and reconciled, then this is going to have to grow out of their being self-dispossessed and obedient. On this account, holy living is profoundly responsive living. Obedience is the key virtue. The willingness to undergo the suffering of what remains hurtful, unreconciled, unredeemed, in a spirit of transfiguring acceptance rather than resistance, is the key practice. And what it requires of us is a quite radical trust in the goodness of God. And I wonder how this lands for you. There's part of me that worries, it's a cop-out, a refusal of my responsibility to more energetically make a difference. But there's also a deeper sense of having been reminded of the one thing necessary. There's a lessening of agitation and fear. It's not that suffering goes away or the sense of despair I spoke about at the beginning. In some sense, it intensifies as I seek to be truly with what is and the givenness of our world. But I sense that it's this suffering that signifies that we are actually beginning to engage at the level it needs to be engaged, the suffering of the world. And it's our consent to this suffering that brings us to the threshold of the virtues that will be our focus for next week, the virtues of faith, hope, and love.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I think there are questions coming in. Leo, are you able to see them? Oh, maybe he's gone. There's one here from Alan. It says, Alan Faulkner, how does one be obedient and yet not be passive in the face of evil? What does that look like?
Yeah, and that's of course the huge question that Wey and Bonhoeffer are wrestling with. And that, that's what I was alluding to at the end, that terrible fear that this is a kind of a cop-out. So it's quite subtle, I think. But I guess I come back to that sense that the contrast isn't obedience and passivity. The contrast is obedience and self-will, or obedience and me trying to bring about what I think is the right outcome. Just because I'm obedient and seeking to listen and act out of that doesn't mean I'm not active in the face of evil. So this is, Martin Luther King, or so it doesn't mean I'm not active. It doesn't mean I don't do things and kind of act out of that necessity. But it's that kind of willingness to seek to be responsive to this other, to God rather than to your own idea of it. And Alan's just added, I guess in its own way, obedience is a form of action. And yeah, I think that's what I would want to say. And that's that idea of active acceptance is a deep form of action, like meditation is a deep form of action. And out of that practice flow other actions, flow obedient actions. So I guess I just want to say the contrast is not between obedience and action, it's between obedience and self-will. And then what that changes is the quality of the action and the sense of acting in accord with necessity, which is has a different power, in the same way that acting out of a real sense of vocation is different from just acting out of, well, I thought it was a good idea at the time.
Can I just ask, what you're describing is, I think, a commentary on Jesus' resist ye not evil, resist not evil. which is a very difficult injunction to understand, but I think you've clarified it. The other point is you're describing a different kind of active response to evil, more like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela. So a different kind of effective action. But the question I would ask is, if you had this bunch of contemplatives, like Bonhoeffer or Simone Weil and these others, or ordinary people like ourselves, who are cultivating this kind of action, or the source for this kind of action, through our contemplation, we're going to find ourselves, this group of contemplatives is going to find themselves rather in the middle between the perpetrators of the evil and those who are resisting it in a more self-willed way, which creates another complexity, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does, and the complexity is inward. Like I've just been alluding to, you know, I feel the tension of that in myself a lot. I guess a way that I find helpful is to think about it is, you know, something like Extinction Rebellion, that movement, which is a kind of a resistance movement. It's a non-violent movement, but it's a kind of a rebellion against the unjust status quo. And I've, you know, went to a meeting. I'm very attracted to what they're doing and have been involved a little bit. But one of the things that struck me when they were out, and they explicitly draw on the principles of nonviolent action from the civil rights movement and Gandhi and all of that. But one of the things that struck me is that even though they draw on those principles and admire those movements, the piece that they didn't talk about was the fact that those nonviolent resistance movements, which were effective, were actually all undergirded by prayer. They were that, you know, they, and same with South Africa, that they were undergirded by prayer. And I guess what I wonder is, this is the invisible bit of the kind of effective action, and it's always tempting to think you don't have time for that. You've just got to get on with, you know, the real work, or the and I'm again not at all wanting to say we just sit around praying and don't do anything, but there is a kind of there's an energetic engagement with the issue at this level of transfiguring acceptance that, you know, that I think, you know, that we can't afford to miss. Or at least if we take seriously our tradition, you know, and our practice, you know, that is part of what it leads us to. Do you think? I mean, what's your sense of that?
I think you're right. No, I think that the contemplative stillness in response to evil or suffering or injustice creates a response and creates an environment in which change is more likely to take place in the right way, but how we do not know.
Yes.
We don't actually know how it happens, but we can show, and quite rightly you say, these civil rights movements and the anti-apartheid movement and the liberation of India and so on, these were all undergirded by prayer. But how they were so effective, it's not so easy to describe.
That's right. So it's, yeah, and you can't, I mean, I guess that whole point is you don't possess it, you can't, you can't make of it a little mechanism that you deploy. All of that makes it difficult.
We are creating the space for God to act in that situation. Anyway,
yeah.
There's a couple of other questions here. Sorry, could you go down one from Liz, the first one, from Liz Waddington. When there is a time to act, how will we know it's God's will rather than our own desires or the ego?
Yeah, well, I guess I said, well, we won't. Not beyond all shadow of a doubt kind of knowing. But I guess the thought is, as best I can discern it, like I've seriously engaged this, I've handed it over, I've sought to let go of my, my attachment to my own looking good about, my own goodness. And this seems to me the thing I must now do. Well, I just do that in trust. And if I'm wrong, well, I also trust that there's something about the genuine purity of my intention that makes it not totally wrong. That's kind of Vey's idea. And that sense, I mean, I think sometimes it's not so, it isn't this agonized process, we just act, and another example Vey uses is, someone who does something heroic, like rescuing someone from drowning or a house. And often people who do that will say, well, it just wasn't a question, I just did it, and she says, this is the kind of, that's an impelled by a kind of necessity. But sometimes when we're agonizing, we have to kind of entrust ourselves to it.
Thank you. There's another question here from Mark Fosprey. Is it not the case that starting from the acceptance of the situation, there is a possibility of a reaction from a deeper level, an inner place in relation to God?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was trying to get at. So again, this acceptance of the situation doesn't mean we resign ourselves to the situation or think it's never going to be different, or but the place out of which it shifts or transforms is a different place than when we just meet it at the same level and try to, resist it or overthrow it or whatever, I guess is the idea. So that quality of accepting, and it's a felt, it's a felt thing. I don't mean it's a feeling, but it's a kind of almost a bodily felt experience when you kind of embrace something that you'd actually rather resist, and you can sense the transfiguring energy of it, I think.
Okay. Maybe the last question, as we have an hour, from Gabriel Parodi in Mexico, one of the organizers of the John Main seminar for this year in Mexico. He asks, is this what you're saying, the concept of acting from right conscience, acting based in right conscience, good conscience?
It's in right
consciousness, he adds as well.
Yeah. I'm not completely sure, because I couldn't give you the old teaching of right conscience, but that sounds right, that when we're speaking about conscience, we're not just thinking about our, what feels right to us, but we're seeking to be answerable to, to the other, and maybe that's what that right consciousness is about.
Thank you. There's one last question. We'll definitely end on this. It's from Peter Yule. He says, much of what you have said relates to the personal journey and struggle and discernment. And he's wondering about the role and place of the community of which we are a part on this journey.
I think that's that's a great question. And clearly there is a role and place. And I sketched, I skimmed quite quickly over the practice of discernment and spoke about, critical thinking and emotional intelligence. And what I should have added there is the role of community, in conversation, dialogue. That's a really critical part of discernment, so that we get out of our own head and frame and all of that. So yes, I would say there is a role and place of community, and I guess that's why, again, these movements of social transformation are communities, communal movements, and it's the same with the contemplative movement. Like it matters that it's a community of practice and a community which is seeking to live into this kind of responsiveness and obedience, which has this transfiguring potential.
Thank you. So, a wonderful boost for our understanding for the week ahead, and many thanks from all over the world coming in here.
Yes.
Are you prepared yet to give us the title of next week's?
Well, I as I indicated below, I'm not sure if I got the title, but the theme is faith, hope, and love, because I think it's once you enter into that space that you actually discover what those virtues, those theological virtues, actually mean, as you need them at that level.
We have a lot to look forward to. Thank you. Thank you so much. Leo, so thanks, Sarah. See you soon, Leo.
And just to thank you, everyone. And so see you next week, same time, same place.
All right. Thanks, Leo. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye.